Hey, true believers, Englentine here. I love the history of comics. I love looking at older comics, the whole nine yards. This is the oldest known comic book in history. Right now. I mean, you know, something may be discovered after the recording of this. We never know. I'm not going to lie to you. This is a reading of it, because I know you'll probably not go out and find one. I don't expect a lot of people to finish this, but hey, I hope you do enjoy it. Just a heads up though, this was done a while ago on my old microphone for my Patreon account, and it was also on a hot summer day with the air conditioning running, so I do apologize for the background noise. The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck, wherein are duly set forth the crosses, chagrins, calamites, checks, chills, changes, and circumgyrations, by which his courtship was attended, showing also the issue of his suit, and his espousal to his lady love. Mr. Oldbuck's first sight of his lady love. Mr. Oldbuck beholds her vanishing in the distance. Mr. Oldbuck in love. He seeks to conquer the tender passion by study. Mr. Oldbuck, finding study ineffectual, tries music. He discovers that all his efforts are in vain. Looking from the window, Mr. Oldbuck espies his lady love. He rushes to the street, but she has vanished. Mr. Oldbuck resolves to write her. Mr. Oldbuck's dream. He receives no reply to his letter. Mr. Oldbuck in despair commits suicide. Fortunately, the sword passes below his arm. For 48 hours he believes himself dead. He returns to life dying of hunger. The third interview. Declaration, sighs, hopes. His beloved one leaves him unhappy wretch. Despair. The remedy? Second suicide of Mr. Oldbuck. Happily the rope is too long. 28 hours afterwards, hearing the voice of his lady love in the street, Mr. Oldbuck forgets that he is hanged and nearly strangles himself. In his haste to reach his lady love, he drags the beam after him, which rather annoys the good folks in the street. Mr. Oldbuck almost overtakes his lady love. Just as he reaches her, he is stopped by invidious fate. Mr. Oldbuck wishes to return home, but can't. He contrives ingeniously to overcome the difficulty. Mr. Oldbuck sends for the doctor. Mr. Oldbuck drinks ass's milk, his physician recommending exercise. He purchases an Arabian courser. Mr. Oldbuck on horseback. Mr. Oldbuck is thrown. His steed retreats to its stable. Raising himself, Mr. Oldbuck perceives his lady love. She is not alone. Duel between Mr. Oldbuck and his rival. Having vanquished his adversary, Mr. Oldbuck declares his passion in the presence of the parents of his beloved. His suit being approved, Miss Oldbuck returns home, and for 3 hours dances for joy. At the length, their patience being exhausted, the enraged neighbors rush in. Mr. Oldbuck is imprisoned for midnight rioting. The old folks, on returning Mr. Oldbuck's visit, hear with astonishment that he is in prison. His third suicide. The match being broken off. Mr. Oldbuck drinks hemlock. Luckily, it is only vegetable soup. For 8 days, Mr. Oldbuck believes himself dead. The rats having gnawed the legs from the chair, he falls and is restored to life. Mr. Oldbuck turns over a new leaf. He buys a watchdog and resolves to travel. Being attacked by robbers, he hides himself and his horse behind a tree. Stripped of everything, Mr. Oldbuck takes refuge in a cave. He is discovered by a hermit who condoles with him. Mr. Oldbuck turns hermit. Tired of seclusion, Mr. Oldbuck escapes in female disguise. On his way, he is accosted by a traveler on whom he recognizes his own habiliments. So at the next inn, he considers that to make an exchange is to commit no robbery. Mr. Oldbuck rescues his horse from a ditch in which it has lain a fortnight. He bewails the miserable condition of his steed. Mr. Oldbuck, finding his horse too weak to walk, treats him to a ride. Arriving at a meadow, Mr. Oldbuck turns his horse into the rich pasture. It soon recovers its flesh. The rural solitude revives Mr. Oldbuck's flame. He becomes sentimental and loves to roam. His horse bursting with fat, Mr. Oldbuck is obliged to return home on foot. On reaching home, Mr. Oldbuck finds a favorable letter from his lady love. He serenades his beloved object, the elopement. Mr. Oldbuck is recaptured by the monks, and he and his beloved imprisoned in different cells. Fourth suicide of Mr. Oldbuck. Fortunately, in his descent, he is caught by the index of a sundial. He turns over a new leaf. Mr. Oldbuck loses heart and falls ill. Profiting by his excessive thinness, Mr. Oldbuck introduces himself through the chimney, which with rather alarms his lady love. They escape from their prison. They continue to advance, their success all but certain. But in fording the ditch, Mr. Oldbuck swallows more water that he relishes. While his lady love dries herself in the sun, Mr. Oldbuck amuses himself by drowning the porter who had pursued them. Taking their evening walk, the parents of the beloved one recognize their dear child at a distance, profiting by his situation. Mr. Oldbuck negotiates and obtains permission to renew his suit. The marriage is about to take place. As he enters the church, Mr. Oldbuck remembers that he has shut his dog at home and goes back to let him out. Returning to the church, he finds neither parents nor child. Makes his will. Exculpates his dog, charges the parents with his death, and requests the police to see to his funeral. Fifth suicide. Mr. Oldbuck throws himself into the Grand Canal. Happily, two thieves fish him up for the sake of a bridal dress. Very determined, however, Mr. Oldbuck does not believe himself the less thoroughly drowned. He is stripped and left naked on the bank, is found by the police, who take him away to be buried, is dug up by birds of prey and returns to life. Dressed in winding sheet, Mr. Oldbuck returns home, but is discovered and pursued as a ghost. Mr. Oldbuck reaches home and almost frightens his heirs out of their wits. He turns over a new leaf. The heirs, having complained to the police, Mr. Oldbuck is committed to prison. Mr. Oldbuck pleads his own case, but is sentenced to a year's imprisonment. He mediates an escape. Having forced his way through the roof, he draws his dog up after him. Mr. Oldbuck passes from the roof of the prison to that of a neighboring house. Mr. Oldbuck sounds the chimney with his dog. The chimney happens to be that of his beloved. Excessive fright of her parents, she recognizes the dog and rushes to its embrace. Unhappily, while engaged in this tender duty, Mr. Oldbuck withdraws the cord. Mr. Oldbuck feels a great weight at the end of the string. Just as they reach the top, the cord breaks. Mr. Oldbuck is saved by falling into a street lamp. The loved one releases her father, who could not bring his mind to relax his hold of her. Another releasement. The whole family meet on the roof and are surprised to find no one there. Mr. Oldbuck, pursued by the police, disguises himself as an officer. Returning to the house of his lady love, Mr. Oldbuck learns that the whole family has been missing for 3 days. Suspecting a plot, he sets out in search of his beloved. At a loss to know what has happened to them, the family gives themselves up to profound grief. At the end of 4 days, they are discovered by a chimney sweep. Passing near some rich pasture, Mr. Oldbuck dismounts to take his horse by the head. Meeting with one of the monks who imprisoned him, Mr. Oldbuck cuts off his beard. He is pursued by a legion of enraged monks. Mr. Oldbuck learns from the little chimney sweep the fate of his lady love and her parents. He mounts the sweep behind him to conduct him to their rescue. He reaches the roof, comprehends the whole affair, and discovers his emaciated dog. Mr. Oldbuck seeks to establish a correspondence with his lady love. The parents of his beloved having, in their fright, changed their apartments, Mr. Oldbuck waits in vain 8 days for a reply. On the 9th, he feels a light weight. In the intoxication of delight, he flatters himself that it is the beloved one herself. A bitter disappointment. The newcomers, taking the rope off Mr. Oldbuck for a pot hook, hang their kettle upon it, and are dreadfully frightened to see it ascend the chimney. Mr. Oldbuck's sensation on discovering his lady love at a window on the opposite side of the street, carried away by an excusable exultation, Mr. Oldbuck breaks a hole in the roof and disappears. Falling into the room of a sleepy citizen, Mr. Oldbuck opens a communication with his lady love by means of the window. Making a rope of the citizen's curtains, he descends without losing sight of his beloved. Midway, Mr. Oldbuck, by a well-directed leap, lands himself exactly in the chamber of his lady love. Blissful moments, which amply repay all his exertions. Even while engaged in making love, Mr. Oldbuck keeps his eyes about him. Meanwhile, the citizen who had complained to the police and having no intruder deliver up is arrested as a trickster buffoon. Second elopement. On this occasion, Mr. Oldbuck conceals his beloved in a close carriage with locked door to prevent every danger. Mr. Oldbuck, espying a monk, spurs forward, unconscious of a little accident which has happened. Mr. Oldbuck, increasing his speed, advances at the rate of 10 leagues an hour. The carriage, found by the diligence, is mounted on the roof. The diligence being overset, the beloved one, favored by fate, floats resignedly on the water. Discovering his loss, Mr. Oldbuck hastens to retrace his steps. Excessive rage of Mr. Oldbuck, who, on reaching the banks of the river, sees his rival in possession of the carriage. Mr. Oldbuck hesitates not to plunge into the river to swim in pursuit of his beloved. In the meantime, the rival who had discovered and boarded the carriage is carried by the current close to a great water wheel. Entangled by the water wheel, the rival gets preciously ducked at every turn. Having reached the carriage, Mr. Oldbuck seats himself upon it and steers with his hat. Mr. Oldbuck seeks a flower enamel bank to land upon. Meanwhile, the rival continues to be soused at every turn. Having landed on a flowery bank, Mr. Oldbuck draws the beloved one from the carriage. Having become extremely thin, Mr. Oldbuck takes her to the mountains to drink milk. The rival continues his evolutions. For the sake of health of his lady love, Mr. Oldbuck leads a pastoral life and takes the provisional name Thyrsis. The rival continues his aquatic amusement. Mr. Oldbuck, under the assumed name of Thyrsis, milks the cow for his beloved. Mr. Oldbuck, under the assumed name of Thyrsis, diverts his lady love with rustic dance. When it begins to get cold, Mr. Oldbuck, under the name of Thyrsis, quits the high ground to seek out balmy spot in the plains. Meanwhile, the water decreasing, the river leaves the carriage aground not far from the Covenant. The great wheel ceases to turn from the same cause. The rival returns to land and dries himself in the sun. The pastoral life, having wonderfully fattened his lady love, Mr. Oldbuck begins to get tired of it. Having constructed a rustic palanquin, Mr. Oldbuck confides in 2 herdsmen the task of conveying them home. Mr. Oldbuck and his lady love, having fallen asleep on the palanquin, are abandoned by the herdsmen. The rival, happening to pass, mounts the beloved one fast asleep on his donkey and carries her off during Mr. Oldbuck's nap. Excessive surprise of Mr. Oldbuck on awakening, persuaded that the herdsmen are the thieves, he pursues them at a rate of 5 leagues an hour. Once at full speed, Mr. Oldbuck, unable to stop or turn aside, darts through the hay-rich. Arriving at the same place, the rival dismounts his sleeping load and feeds his ass. The ass bites the foot of Mr. Oldbuck, who in vain shrieks aloud in the stack. The rival going to sleep, the ass eats much hay, and Mr. Oldbuck begins to make his way out. Torments of jealousy, getting out. Mr. Oldbuck mounts his lady love on the ass and makes off in double quick time. On awaking, the beloved asks, "Where are the herdsmen?" Mr. Oldbuck continues his route, dragging the ass after him. Crossing the territories of the monks, Mr. Oldbuck disguises himself as a miller and passes his lady love off as a sack of flour. The monks, having the right of toll, probe the sack, which collapses, uttering a frightful cry. On seeing the sack begin to walk, the terrified monks, much to the satisfaction of Mr. Oldbuck, run off as fast as their legs can carry them. The sack becomes untied. The monks return to the charge and carry off the beloved one. Mr. Oldbuck and his lady love have been tried and condemned, are led to the stake. The fire having consumed the bottom of the posts, Mr. Oldbuck and his beloved make their escape. They throw themselves into the river and swim to the place where the carriage is stranded. While his lady love dries herself in the sun, Mr. Oldbuck raises the carriage and is nearly upset by the myriads of frogs disturbed by his intrusion. Perceiving that he is pursued by the monks, Mr. Oldbuck hastens to lock himself and his lady love in the carriage, having first scattered some crowns on the ground. The two monks, thinking from the crowns that the carriage contains an immense treasure, dig a hole to hide it for themselves. When it is deep enough, Mr. Oldbuck slips gently out of the carriage, pushes the monks into the hole, and throws the earth upon them. Having carefully buried the monks up to the neck, Mr. Oldbuck politely takes leave of them and makes off at his utmost speed. The prolonged flight much fatigues the beloved one, so Mr. Oldbuck gallantly takes the first opportunity which presents itself to procure a carriage. Grand display of Mr. Oldbuck's strength. Mr. Oldbuck's foot slipping, the wheelbarrow passes over him and rushes down the hill with the speed of lightning. The monks, hearing a great noise behind them, are very uneasy and cry out for help with all of their might. The noise waking up the rival, he hears the cries for help, hastens to see what is the matter, and recaptures the beloved one. Mr. Oldbuck, having somewhat recovered, pursues at full speed, 15 leagues in 3 hours. Passing near the monks, he learns from what has happened. In gratitude, Mr. Oldbuck releases them and sets out at his utmost speed, 20 leagues in 2 hours. Night having arrived, the rival, for greater security, snatches some winks of sleep without leaving hold of the wheelbarrow. Mr. Oldbuck, having discovered them, takes advantage of his rival's sleep to tie his hands to the wheelbarrow, and availing himself of his artifice, walks home at his ease. On reaching home, Mr. Oldbuck turns over a new leaf. Happy denouement of the history of Mr. Oldbuck. The end. There you go, gang. I hope you enjoyed. There's like one person making it to the end here. It's me. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoy this. It is the oldest known comic book. So I thought it was kind of cool, and I would share it. Like I said, it was recorded a while ago. I found it again. I was like, oh, okay, I should put this over here to go along with the history of comics videos that I've been doing before I move on to the occult and the Yellow Kid stuff. Anyway, there you go. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to click like and share, subscribe, hit that notification bell, of course, and if you don't mind helping out the channel, go on to Patreon and to Ko-Fi, and just drop $1 in the till. Help me keep the lights on. Help us keep making videos for you. I'd like to thank everybody who's already done that, and to everyone, all of the true believers, thank you very, very much for watching.